Hi, Susan.
There we go. Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm very well, thank you.
I'm wondering what you are seeing.
I'm seeing a thing that says terms, anti-Semitism. That says crucifixion and anti-Semitism.
Okay, that's all you see.
That's all I see.
Just a blue background with those words.
That's correct. And then
Okay.
you and I on there. Oh, Cheeky just sent a message. What does that say? Can you send the link for the Zoom meeting? Yes, I can.
Yeah. It's one is in an email that she had received this morning.
Yeah. Yeah, she's not always on top of her
Oh,
stuff.
I understand. She's busy. That
She
happens.
is.
How are you
And
doing, Susan?
I'm well, thank you.
Hmm.
I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, and I don't know if now is a time to bring up the question or not, but one of the questions I have is I have struggled with understanding how being supportive of a ceasefire or the end to the attacks on Palestine, why it's viewed as anti-Semitic, and some of the things that are coming up. The Trump administration is a whole different thing, but
yeah, right.
they just did this stuff. I think it was at Harvard where they were claiming, oh, this is all to combat anti-Semitism, and it seems like the water's gotten very muddy.
It
It's
is
where it's black and white.
it is totally muddy. It's completely black and white. I think on both sides right now.
Yeah.
And I think that there are ways in which you can formulate an idea about, um, what is happening over there. I'm not going to go into it today. That doesn't have to be, that isn't necessarily anti-Semitic. What I do wholeheartedly believe is that there have been way too many anti-Semitic symbols and
Mm,
slogans used
hmm
in protest for Gaza.
mm,
I mean, just constant.
mm,
And the harassment of students on campus is real, of Jewish
hmm
students.
hmm
The uptick in anti-Semitic violence is also real.
Joel Shapiro, whose home was
Yeah,
just firebombed over the weekend.
right. That's right. Although we don't know that it was related to this, but it's possible.
The timing seems suspect, but yeah.
Right. That's right. So, and honestly, I've also um, have had really heard her very Islamophobic comments.
Hmm
So I think that my initial response was, of course, Israel has the right to defend itself.
Of course. Yeah.
But right now, I don't think that Netanyahu is at all interested in establishing peace, but only interested in maintaining his power base, and that's what he's up to.
Yeah.
That's unforgivable.
Yeah. I agree.
It's unforgivable. And so, and then the assault on um, these students.
The tough students,
Yeah,
the
in
woman
Colombia.
on a student visa. Oh my
That's right.
gosh.
There was a
And she's
student.
brilliant. She's brilliant. Why would we want to lose someone so qualified and
We don't.
um, unusual? So
Yeah, no, we really don't. So it's very hard to witness this, and also, um, and then at the same time, if you want to go and join the protest, then it's immediately you're in the midst of people who are waving Hamas colors and doing so uncritically. And so it's like, but I can't go there,
Right.
yeah,
right? So it's really an impossible situation,
yeah.
I feel.
No.
iPad is here.
I bet.
Yeah.
Hello, iPad. Hello, everybody.
There's Chicky. That's
That's me
iPad.
on my iPad. Yeah.
I'm here, but I'm not going to show my picture because I'm half asleep.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Polly.
Hi there.
Hello.
I haven't been on Zoom for a while. The book club that I do from Missouri has started using Google, something that's through Google. We saved a whole $5 a year or something this way,
Oh, Teams or something?
but
Is it called Teams?
yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got the TV on. I'm gonna go turn it off. I
You
thought I
guys are
had-
gonna get the fine experience of watching me eat dinner. I'm gonna mute myself.
You enjoy your dinner.
Yeah, no worries. We understand.
Hi, Carolyn. Nice to see you.
Hi, Niels. Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah. And Jim and Moira are here.
I love that name, Moira. I just love it.
Hmm.
It's just a happy sound.
That was probably a happy thing you were saying, Moira, but you were on mute.
I like the name Moira. I regret that I didn't just on my first day at Hillcrest and say, my name is Moira. Oh,
Just gonna wait a couple of minutes and then we'll go ahead. How's everybody doing this evening?
Good.
Yeah.
I'd like it to stay cool and not get hot.
Yeah, same here.
It was just fine.
likewise.
I have like a corner window here in this room. One window doesn't move at all. It's just been
On the,
on the headset, and
yeah.
last year I had a blanket with thumbtacks up around these two windows, and I'm not looking
That's
for
hot.
that, but I don't want to invest.
Well,
Look who else is here.
Yeah.
Yeah, if he gets any bigger. The other one is sleeping in another room.
Have my video on. Cool, right?
Yeah. All right, I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. I think I'm going to do it this way. So you're all seeing the screen, the title.
Mhm.
Is that right?
Right?
Good. This is the first time I'm using this particular software, so I'm, you know, still. Here's Carolyn. Anyway, so that's what we're talking about today, crucifixion and anti-Semitism. And it's really a simple thing that I have in mind, which is just raise awareness around certain forms of anti-Semitism that I believe lurk in the shadows of liberal and progressive churches mostly, and that many people are not aware of or just flat out deny. And I think they exist. I feel them, I see them, and I want to just be able to talk about it. Let me just start off with a few terms that you hear around, and sometimes the distinctions are meaningful and sometimes less so, I believe. So one term is anti-Semitism, and there's many definitions about the term anti-Semitism. I'm going to share one in a moment. but it's a very, there are conferences about this. It is very political. I'm using the spelling that I learned from Deborah Lipstadt, who is a professor at Emory University, who is one of the, I don't know, worldwide experts on anti-Semitism, I believe. And she doesn't do hyphenation and capitalization because basically it's a nonsensical word. Because it's not necessarily anti-Semitic, since Arabs are also Semitic people, and they're not included in the term, and it has a kind of a strange history as a term. So she just uses this as one word to make it clear what we're talking about, but not to suggest that there's any kind of meaningful connection between the way the word is constructed and what it actually is about. Anti-Judaism is really it's kind of an antipathy or a hatred towards the faith called Judaism. And some people will hold that you can be anti-Judaic, that is to say, opposed to certain teachings in Judaism, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're anti-Semitic. I find that distinction personally very theoretical and almost a distinction without a difference in reality. But for a purely, theoretical perspective, all right. And then there's a notion of supersessionism. Now, supersessionism, and I'm going to talk about that later this evening, is really the idea that Christianity superseded Judaism. That Judaism was kind of a limited form of thinking and worshiping God, and then Jesus came, and now we have the better way. And that so many different things that Jesus was talking about and doing were repudiations of practices in Judaism, outright critiques, or expansions. And so it's a way of holding out Christianity as the more evolved religion as opposed to Judaism. And it doesn't allow for a way of looking at Judaism as its own faith, its own background, its own tradition, that is as worthy of respect as any other religion, certainly as Christianity. And this has led to at least a lot of misrepresentation, but also to outright anti-Semitism. Perhaps the most famous supersessionist anti-Semite in the Protestant church was Martin Luther himself, who wrote a whole book about the Jews, which is vitriolically anti-Semitic. Not staunch Lutherans will argue with this point, but it's undeniable as far as I'm concerned. So we have within our tradition, very prominent people who have held anti-Semitic views and expressed them quite firmly. And some people say, he wasn't really anti-Semitic, he was just disappointed that the Jews didn't convert to Christianity, which, that's like the parents saying, I'm not angry, I'm disappointed. Of course he was, because he thought that Christianity was had superseded Judaism, and therefore didn't take it seriously. And when Jews thought, oh, you should take it seriously, they were bad people, according to him. And he wrote very nasty treatises about them. One thing I'm not going to talk about this evening is kind of the conversation about anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism. Very intricate, many different angles to that conversation for another time, if we need to talk about it at all. I also don't have the intention of going into the intricacies of the Israel-Hamas war as it is raging. Susan Carroll and I were just talking about it very briefly as some of you were coming in, but that's not really the topic for tonight. If you want to talk about it sometime, then I'll be happy to talk about it. In fact, I may have to, but yeah, let me know what you think. So how I became aware of this, the need for Christians to talk about anti-Semitism before I was a Christian. I lived in Amsterdam. I just moved there to go to college, and then I got a pamphlet in my mailbox from a hate group in Holland that was rabidly anti-Semitic, and it put in it this line from the Gospel of Matthew as quote unquote proof that really there's something wrong with Jews and that they need to be either converting or be prosecuted. And it's because the Bible says, His blood be on us and our children. And you've all heard this verse, I'm sure. This is not a new one to you. This one line has been used more than any other line, I think, in any form of hate that I can think of. I don't think you can point to any one line that has been used against Muslims, for instance. And Islamophobia is a very real phenomenon, but I don't know that there is one line that always gets used against Muslims in the way that this one line has over many centuries been used to persecute Jews over Europe, in many places in the world, to very, very deadly effect. Anyway, I reported this. It was a known hate group in Holland, and they were cited. I don't know what happened to them, but people really took it very seriously when I reported this. There are some other lines, of course, in the scriptures, and this is, as I was preparing for our Easter Sunday, I was coming across some of these lines, and I was like, I need to really talk about this, because there's this one from the book of John. Caiaphas was the head priest in the time of Jesus, in the time of the resurrection. And the line says, Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Now, there's many different ways to read a line like this, but again, this one has, the book of John in translation talks about the Jews. The Greek word is Judaioi, and so sometimes people translate it as the Judeans, not as the Jews, to kind of make a distinguish between the two. I don't know that that is much better. This line makes it clear that this is really the head priest who is in his position of authority because the Romans let him be there. And if the Romans are smelling trouble, he is going to fear for his life, or at least for his livelihood, and be kicked out of his position as head priest. And so if there was a collusion between Caiaphas and the Romans, then that is a plausible thing, but it doesn't mean that it was all the Jews, even though the book of John, for its own reasons, sometimes sounds like it was. But it was really talking about the upper echelon of the temple hierarchy that was in collaboration with the Romans. Further up in the book of John, you'll find this passage. It was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. And he said to the Jews, he is in this case Pilate, the Roman governor. And again, to the Jews is what the translations read. And here is your king, they cried out, away with him. Pilate asked him, shall I crucify your king? And then the chief priest is smart enough to answer, we have no king but Caesar, because he wants to make sure that Pilate understands, I am on your side. I am not going to be an insurrectionist who thinks that there are other powers that are going to be in opposition or higher than Caesar, who is ruling at this point over Judea. And so what you see is that there in the book of John, the Jews is used as a generalized term, but it's referring to an inside political debate about an elite, a temple elite that needs the Roman Empire for their position, and people who are opposing that elite and who are saying that is not the way in which you interact and collaborate with an empire of this kind. And so it was a very political debate and a question about how do you act in times of occupation. And, you know, having learned from my own history in my own country, there were many different opinions about how you should behave yourself during the German occupation when that happened in 1940, 1945. And, yeah, so that's the kind of debate that we are really talking about. But again, the way it reads and the way it's been used for 19, 20 centuries is to say the Jews killed Jesus. So that's really the question, right? Even though the Gospels suggest that it is the Jews, the priests, the temple hierarchy that killed Jesus, there's real reasons to question that. And one of the reasons I'm raising that again, even though you probably heard about it, are you familiar with the name Richard Rohr? Richard Rohr is a friend. Yes, Katie is. I can't see you all, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm familiar with them.
Yeah. I mean, he's a Franciscan priest. He runs a center for action and contemplation in New Mexico. You know, and he wrote a book, The Universal Christ. And he's very much trying to step away from oppressive forms of religion. Excuse me. And so I was interested in hearing what he had to say. I was listening to the book, and then all of a sudden I hear him talk about the Jews killing Jesus. And I'm like, really? Is that, are we still there? Are we still doing that? Because everybody who has paid a little bit of attention to this question understands that crucifixion was a punishment that was only done by the Romans. And the reason the Romans would use the crucifixion was because they wanted to prevent an insurrection, or they wanted to punish people who were rising up against their rule. So even the story of the thieves on the cross that you find in the book of Luke is not fully accurate, because people weren't crucified for stealing. They were crucified for rising up against the Roman rule. Now, it wasn't a fine thing, right? I mean, the idea of a court and showing proof and all those kinds of things, that wasn't really how the Romans did this. If they suspected that you were rising up, or that there was a group rising up against their rule, they would very easily crucify you. Rome was a totally brutal, totalitarian regime, and they didn't really care. If they got the wrong person, they didn't care. If they got a few extra, they didn't care, as long as the point came across that when you rise up against Rome, you're going to suffer a horrible death. And it's going to happen in full public view. And so since we know that that is what crucifixion was, we also realize that Jesus was a threat to Rome. That's what we have to surmise, that the message that he shared was perceived less, not so much an internal conversation, but an actual threat to the rule of Rome, which was at that point the strongest, most solid empire that the world had ever seen. So that's not a small thing. It's like, and yeah, they didn't play around. And Jesus, in his teaching, in his call for justice, was seen as a threat. But was it really a huge threat? Maybe not. And this is a little bit of speculation. But if the Romans perceived a real life threat to their rule, they rounded up everybody and they crucified them. That only Jesus was crucified and none of his followers suggests that they were a little bit concerned about him, but not that much. It wasn't, there wasn't an overt, almost riot, almost insurrection happening. Because if that had been the case, large groups of his followers would have been rounded up and crucified, summarily executed right next to Jesus on the cross. And that didn't happen, as far as we know.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Is that one of the reasons why so many Peter and others, they went into hiding after his crucifixion? Was that tied
Yes.
to it?
Yeah,
Okay.
they were scared, and they had cause to be scared. Because if they were walking around as if they were, identifying with Jesus, who was now crucified, so identifying with him was already very dangerous. Then, that would have been that would have put them at risk, absolutely. But there was also no active seeking out of Jesus' followers. So it's not as if the Romans thought, oh, this is an imminent threat. They thought with just him, that was it. They'd done enough. And so it was a little bit of a threat. So in response to, somebody like Richard Rohr, I'm drawing this out a little further. It's like, no, the Jews did not kill Jesus. The Romans killed Jesus. Cannot say it enough. It is very important. And there's very many theological implications of that fact. Another one is, this one has come up more recently. It's the idea that, people have been saying Jesus was a Palestinian. And that's not true. And it cannot be true. So for historical background, Palestine came into existence in a little more than a century after the death of Jesus. And it was done because the Emperor Hadrian was so fed up with the Jewish revolts that kept going on since the times of Jesus, that he said, we're just going to put an end to the whole thing. And we're not even going to change the name. Kind of like it's the Gulf of America, not the Gulf of Mexico, and those kinds of.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's not all in the past, right? There's so many parallels that I could go on about, but in my view, to make the statement that Jesus was a Palestine, does two things. One, it misreads the history. There was no such thing as Palestine in the time of Jesus. He was a Jew, lived as a Jew, died as a Jew, was resurrected as a Jew. And you'll see this on Sunday, but when Mary Magdalene recognizes him at the grave at the time after the resurrection, she says Rabboni, which is Hebrew for teacher. And she recognized him in that Jewish role. I think that to rob somebody of their core identity is a form of hate. It just is. So that's why I find that slogan that I've heard many pastors use in the past year and a half or so deeply, deeply problematic. And I don't think they're fully aware of the implications. One of the other implications is that if you say Jesus was a Palestinian, then we now have once again a situation where the Jews killed Jesus. And if you make the solidarity of Jesus automatically with the Palestinians, which for political reasons I can understand, but if you're saying Jesus was not Jewish but a Palestinian, the implication is that the Jews are killing Jesus again. And I'm not understanding why people are not understanding that. But that is because so many people in the liberal progressive world will loudly claim, I'm not anti-Semitic.
No.
And that's fine. They will say, oh, I hear, Jesus was a Jew, I recognize this, and so I cannot be anti-Semitic. And what I want to say is, that is like me saying, oh, I'm not a racist, I'm not a sexist. In these same liberal progressive circles that I know quite well, if somebody like me, a white man, steps in a room and says, oh, I'm not racist, they will laugh at me, if not worse. Because they're like, it's not for you to say. It's not for you to say. And I think, in fact, I could not conceive of anybody really at, say, the annual gathering of the Northern California Nevada Conference saying that, like, if any white clergy person would say, I'm not racist. I don't see it. But why is it okay to do that about anti-Semitism is a really interesting question. Question, what is anti-Semitism? Who gets to say so? Again, there's many different, it's a big debate right now. I found this one quite useful. But this is from Brett Stevens, who's a New York Times columnist. And he simply says, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that holds that Jews are uniquely prone to use devious means to further malevolent ends. It's a conspiracy theory, and it says, everywhere you look, you'll find the Jews are up to something that they do worse than others, and they're doing it to subvert, to undermine our way of life, or whatever it is that people are upset
To get
about.
rich, to
get rich, and then they're using their wealth to do bad things. The George Soros straw people at the time. And anyway, so take it for what it is. There is, a big debate about which definitions to adopt. But this gets the point across, I believe. Now, how does this debate continue? I want to give an example of how I have seen, again, progressive Christians use certain kinds of theology, and they're probably not aware of how problematic their theology is and what it is that they are legitimizing when they do so. And one recent example where you saw this happening is after J.D. Vance, our vice president, talked about the Catholic teaching of Odo Amoris. Odo Amoris is an old Catholic teaching called the Order of Love. And according to J.D. Vance, what it means is that you first of all love the people who are close to you, and then once you have loved them enough, then you kind of broaden the circle, so to speak, to your community. And then once you have that established, you broaden your love for the circle. Yes, it's kind of a concentric circle model of love. And he was using it to suggest that, no, you can really love your country first and foremost. And in fact, Catholic teaching, he suggests, tells you that is what you should be doing before you love other countries. In other words, America first. He was, of course, quite swiftly rebuked by none other than Pope Francis. And he said that the true Odo Amoris that must be promoted is love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. So that was a nice way to come back to it. But again, when you look at the ways in which people then argue against this from a more progressive point of view, what you will see is that they argue biblically, but in a way that has some problems with it. But And I'm using this as an example, but I've seen this happen all over the place. One example is the pastor Brendan Moser. He's from Arizona. And he talks about the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, that's a familiar story to us all. And he explains that as Jesus was teaching the Jews that they shouldn't be ethnocentric, that the Samaritans are our neighbors and that we should love them as ourselves. And that this was basically a way of overcoming tribalism and ethnocentricity. Others will argue that when you read the story, that this is more about hierarchy, that who Jesus was addressing in that story was not so much the Jews at large, but again, the priests. It was, after all, the priest who walked by and who left the man in the ditch, the one who was robbed. It wasn't just anybody. But it brings in this idea, and it's subtle, that Judaism was, at the time of Jesus, kind of a tribal identity, and that one of the functions of Jesus was to break God out of a tribal mold. And that is, that comes from a liberation theology perspective. I am a liberation theologian, mostly, but I also have seen that if you think that Jesus was opposing hierarchy and power structures, then it is very easy to surmise that Judaism was basically upholding strict hierarchies and power structures, and that the liberation was from established forms of Judaism rather than, say, temple hierarchy. And that has led to very specific problematic readings of the text. For instance, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you can read something that says, "You have heard it, that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." Matthew 5. I think it's a familiar passage. You've read it. Now, the word "but" that appears twice in just this one passage here has led many people to suggest that Jesus was basically doing away with the Old Testament teaching and replacing it with new teaching. That is not, in fact, what is happening. What Jesus is doing here is what is known as fencing. And fencing is really a very well established Jewish way of arguing with the text. So within Judaism, the scripture is not a uniform, there's not a uniform way to explain the text. There are many multiple ways of interpreting scripture. And these have been recorded in various traditions. The Midrash, the Mishnah, the Talmud puts it all together in a big library where rabbis over centuries debate how to read various passages of scripture. And they, in those debates, do all kinds of things to basically make, some of the harder, for instance, some of the things that they do is make it easier to handle some of the rules in the scriptures. For instance, if there is a line that says, "Oh, if you have a young woman who does X, Y, and Z, you should stone her," then what the rabbis will do is come up with so many roadblocks to say, well, that's not true, but we should really make sure that we have enough evidence. So we need to have at least 4 witnesses, and these 4 witnesses need to be all of very good repute, and then they also should really swear on it. And then they have a whole bunch of different rules that make it so that in reality, nobody ever gets to be stoned for a particular offense. Fencing is another traditional, really a traditional Jewish way of arguing with the text that says, it's perhaps most clear in, so there's one of the 10 commandments is you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And Jesus then says, if you but so look with lust at another one's wife, you have already committed adultery. That is fencing at work, which it means like he's not replacing the Old Testament rule. He's saying, if you really want to follow the rule, then you should have a fence well ahead before the actual transgression, so that you can't even come close to coveting your neighbor's wife in this particular example. You follow what I'm saying there? It's like you can't even begin to get there, because even before, even just casting a glance at somebody with a slightly lustful eye, that's already problematic. So if you notice that you're doing that, stay well away. And so in that sense, Jesus was very much operating as a Jew, arguing within Judaism, following very much Judaic rules. And the same in the passage that I read before. That's, you have heard it say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evildoer. It's a way of making sure that you don't get to the place where you have to give an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In the way that Jews do that. In the same way that there is no death penalty right now in Israel, because so many rabbis over the centuries have put up these extra fences, if you want, around those kinds of lines in scripture that you can't get to them anymore. Right? And so if you follow Jesus, and he says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, also go to the second one, that prevents you from having to get into the atmosphere of asking for an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
And so to suggest, as Pastor Brendan Moser was doing, that Jesus was arguing against Judaism rather than within Judaism, makes it sound like Vance, Vice President Vance, was critiqued for being almost too Jewish. And that's a very subtle way of arguing your point as kind of from a liberation perspective, while not fully understanding that Jesus was indeed acting as a Jew, not against his Jewishness and against his tradition. So on Friday, we're going to have a meal. We're doing it on Friday, but it is, of course, commemorating the Maundy Thursday meal. And there is a movement, has been for some time now within Christianity, of hosting this as if it was a Seder. And that's a very interesting idea, but it's also deeply, deeply problematic. One is a Seder, let me just say, the first question is, was the last meal really a Passover meal? Some Gospels say so, but it's very implausible. You see, at the time of Jesus, when you celebrated the Passover, what you did was you went and sacrificed animals. And after the sacrifice was performed in particular ways by the priest, you then took the meat home, and then you had the meal from the sacrificed meat. So if Jesus is having the Passover meal before or on the morning of Passover, then the sacrifice has not yet been made, and then it can't be a Passover meal, if you follow what I'm saying. And so the gospel writers have a different intention with this. And the the important fact to remember is that the temple was completely destroyed in the year 70, and that what we now know as a Passover Seder was developed after that year. Seder means order. And it was a way in which the rabbis in Judaism came together and said, well, if we can't celebrate our Passover meal in the temple in the way that we're used to, we are going to have to do something else. And that is what we now, over the centuries that grew and many things were added, but it's now what we call a Passover Seder. But when Jesus was having his meal, he actually abstained. He wasn't having a meal. In the book of Luke, you can read, I have earnestly desired to eat this Paschal lamb with you before I suffer. For I tell you that I shall not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And I shall not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So Jesus was actually not celebrating the Passover meal, if there was a Passover meal, but he was in fact abstaining according to this particular piece of the gospel. There is also part of the early Christian tradition that said that the lamb, the sacrificial lamb that we celebrate, was Jesus. He became the sacrificial lamb. And you read that in Paul when he said, our Paschal lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now that again, if you bring that together with a Passover meal, is saying the original sacrificial lamb has been replaced by Jesus, right? And so you're getting into a supersessionist argument when you bring in a Passover Seder into a Christian context as a form of celebration of Easter or of Holy Week. Now, if you want to do it and invite Jews over to teach you how to have a Seder out of respect for the tradition, it's a completely different story. Completely different story. And if you get the opportunity to sit in on a Seder, I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But it's then owned as a sacred tradition by Jews, not by Christians. Because if Christians make it their own, they're kind of taking the tradition over and adding meanings to it that actually undermine what the Passover means in Jewish context. And that has to do with that notion that Jesus became the sacrificial lamb. And that's an undermining of the Passover meal and the Passover Seder rather than a celebration of it.
Isn't that called appropriation?
So appropriation is one element of it.
Yeah.
Well, the original Passover was in Egypt, wasn't it? Where they...
Well, the Passover is a commemoration of the liberation from Egypt. That's
Yes.
right. And so a Seder has a very prescribed set of elements in its meal, all which have symbolism that referred back to the scriptures as they talk about what it meant to be.
God passed over when I guess you had, I don't
Yes.
know, have the mezuzah or on the doorway or...
No, the mezuzah is a different story. If you put the blood of the lamb on your doorpost, then Jesus would God passed by the houses where you lived and would spare the people who lived in it. Whereas if you didn't have that, came to strike you down. So that's what that refers to. That's correct. So we're getting a mixing of metaphors if we're bringing the kind of the notion of Passover Seder into a Christian context. Either Jesus fasted and was the sacrificial lamb, or Jesus upheld the Jewish customs. And you kind of have to decide which of the two you want to uphold and you know make present in the worship. But if you creating without unknowingly, right? A lot of this stuff is people are not fully aware of the implications of what this all can mean. So that the Passover meal became transformed into a meal in which not lambs were sacrificed, but Jesus. Then you're turning the celebration of the Passover meal into a supersessionist notion, where Christianity has now overstepped, stepped over, superseded Judaism. And now we're undermining Judaism as its own form of religion. Anyway, so I've said a lot in a short amount of time. Let me end it there and see if there are some things that you want to raise, ask, note.
I would
Yes.
like, is it okay if I ask a question? It's
Yeah,
Chick-
Carolyn and then Chiki.
Sure.
Well, the topic of the day, of course, is that anti-Semitism is being used as a weapon against universities, against many of our institutions right now. And my Jewish friends tell me that that's how they feel, that it's being misused.
Yes, I agree.
That they are feeling used, that it's being used, a topic that's important to them and that should be very legitimately supported is being used for their own devices, and they're very angry about it, and I'm just appalled with it. So I feel like that's the big topic of the day, because people are defending doing some very awful things under the name of anti-Semitism. So it's a comment, I guess, or a,
No. I couldn't agree more. Let me just say this. The reason I was presenting what I was presenting today is because there are many subtle forms of anti-Semitism alive within the liberal progressive Christian tradition that I don't ever see debated. And when I have raised it with some people, I've been, people have chosen to remain silent about this. And I don't think you can have an honest conversation about anti-Semitism over there when it's alive and well in your own backyard. So that's what I was trying to do. I could not agree with you more about the horrific things that are happening right now with the expulsion of students, even though some of them I fundamentally disagree with. What is happening to them is also completely objectionable. Right, and it's the right that they have to say what they say and to not be persecuted for it is fundamental to our Constitution and to the way of America. So, and that anti-Semitism is being used as a weapon by people. I mean, the current government right now couldn't care less about anti-Semitism and Jews. And
Don't care about anything.
Right? They couldn't care less.
Yeah.
And they've demonstrated that many, many times over.
Except when it, like Carolyn is saying, helps them with their personal objectives.
That's exactly
Right.
right.
Let's not pay Harvard, and
Yeah, exactly right.
it's being used as a weapon without question, I think. And my Jewish friends, I mean, who I keep consulting, do you view it this way? And they absolutely do. They feel used.
Yeah.
And it's, I think it's important to educate people on that point. Because it's in the news every day, and people are, I think unless you talk to Jewish people, you don't have a clue. You may not understand that their perspective on this topic. Now, I'm sure there are Jews that maybe like what's happening. I have no idea. But
there's a broad range of opinions among Jews, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Both philosophically, theologically, as well as politically. And one of the
progressive Jews are feeling used. Is that a correct way to term it? That progressive Judaism?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know either.
Well, the Jewish people that I'm the best friends with for many, many years are conservative Jews, which I always found amusing because the wife is this attorney career gal who is just so assertive. And yet I think it's funny to picture them worshiping in separate sections of the churches they do in the conservative synagogue. But I mean,
Well, actually, that's not true. The conservative synagogues don't have a gender segregated worship. That's the Orthodox.
oh, well, they're the
Jews who
ones that are
do
in the
that.
middle. But I didn't think she sat with her husband anyway.
Then it would be an Orthodox family. Chicky was going to ask a question. I don't want to miss her. Sorry, Paulette. I'll come back to you in a moment. Is that okay? But Chicky was going to ask a question.
Before the election, we had a group of about 6 young men over for dinner one night. Duncan's friends, and they were all about 24 at the time. And they got into a discussion. We were talking about politics a little bit, and 3 or 4 of them said to me, well, yes, I am going to vote, but you probably aren't going to be happy with how I vote. And Duncan was quite uncomfortable with the conversation, so I didn't get to just ask them, what they thought. But one part of the conversation that I did not understand that you might have brought up an explanation for is one of the kids I always thought was Jewish, but he clearly must be Catholic. And he was really hot under the collar about the Jews killing Jesus. And I totally did not follow that conversation, did not know what he was talking about. And it must be this bit that you're referring to, where some people, is that part of the Catholic tradition, or is it conspiracy theorists, or what is that?
Widespread in Christianity. It's
Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Which said, what?
It's widespread in Christianity.
Yeah.
This idea that the Jews killed Jesus.
I remember that from my upbringing because, yeah, the in ignorance, not really realizing that, there weren't Christians really, at that time. But yeah, and then I remember this big thing about Jews for Jesus, right? That they were the good Jews, and this goes back to the 70s.
Right. Katie.
Well, I've heard the term used, the hierarchy of the temple, and the idea that at least the leaders of the temple had sort of caved into Rome, and they were on the tape that they would do what Rome wanted to do because they wanted their power. And so is there truth to that, or is that an exaggeration?
Oh yeah, no, that's quite established historical fact that there was indeed. So originally, to be a priest you were a priest for life. Now it had been a couple of centuries already in the temple worship that wasn't really practiced, because you were a priest by the grace of either the first the Hasmonean and Maccabean kings, and then later who were ruling over Israel, over Judea and Galilee, kind of from a Hellenistic perspective, and they were very interested in bringing Hellenistic culture, and who were prosecuting people if they were not going along with certain Hellenistic features in their lives. And then when Rome occupied the territories, they had their vassals. This is how Romans did it. And this is how colonial states have done it up until the 1960s and 70s. And some of them still do, by having local rulers execute and create order on their behalf. And so the temple priests were part of that system. And if they didn't follow suit, they were gone. Right? So when you read in that one passage that Caiaphas is like, if we sacrifice Jesus for the sake of the many, that what he means is we keep the order. We are not going to fall into chaos if we sacrifice this one person. And it keeps him alive, basically, as the priest of the temple. That's what that refers to.
So it seems sort of unfortunate that maybe these polluters have brought on criticism of the whole Jewish culture because of what they did is followers of Roman power.
And so, it's a real question. Why did the gospel writers talk about the Jews as having killed Jesus? And because they could have said the Romans did it, right? But and so people have speculated about this question. One of the speculations is that they did so because they didn't want to be persecuted by Rome themselves. And so if they had said Rome killed Jesus, then they would have ended as a Christian sect, as the followers of the way. It was the word Christian didn't exist yet when Luke wrote the gospel. Came a little bit, well, in the book of Acts is the first time that is mentioned, the second book written by Luke. But it's several decades after Jesus' death. And so they didn't want to talk about it because they were afraid of being prosecuted by Rome. Rome had burned Jerusalem down to the ground and destroyed the temple. I mean, completely annihilated. It's what you see now, the Western Wall, on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I mean, there's just one piece left. It was an enormous complex, and it was completely destroyed by Rome.
But that rings of the same thing of what Caiaphas and whatever, they were protecting their position. They were throwing a sacrifice. So it was Caiaphas was throwing Jesus. Now the people following the way or whatever, the gospel writers were throwing the Jews, sacrificing them, right? So that they could tell their story without upsetting Rome.
Well, most of the gospel writers were Jewish themselves. We don't know if Luke was.
Oh, no, that's a good point.
But they were, the early followers of Jesus were Jews.
Yeah, of course.
And then Paul makes his journeys into the wider world, and then he converts many Gentiles. And that's actually where Christianity as a separate faith tradition takes off. The original Jewish Christian group, the followers of Jesus, they actually didn't survive. After the fall of, what most people believe is that after the fall of Jerusalem, the Jewish followers of Jesus, so we're talking now almost 40 years after the crucifixion, the Jewish followers of Jesus kind of moved out of Jerusalem into places like in Syria, what is now Syria and Jordan, and they kind of integrated into the local communities, and they didn't really survive that onslaught. That's how cataclysmic Rome's destruction of Jerusalem really was. So where Christianity ended up surviving is among the Gentiles, where Paul had been working, which is how we get to have our Christian tradition. But it then becomes a very different context. And most of the Gospels, like the Gospel of John in particular, was written well after the destruction of the temple. And so that makes it, that's another important element. The Gospel of John was written around 90, 100 or so.
Mark was the first gospel.
Mark was the first gospel, and there's debate whether Mark was written right before the destruction of the temple or right after. I'm not enough of an insider to have an opinion on it. But Matthew and Luke most definitely were written after the destruction of the temple, and John much later. And so when you read these Gospels, not only do you have to keep in mind that Jesus was living under colonial rule, but that the Gospel writers were responding to when I say cataclysmic, just imagine 10 times the 9/11. The impact 9/11 had on our country and on the world really was tremendous. For the Jews at the time, the destruction of the temple and the burning down of Jerusalem was a much bigger event than that.
At what point in history did Jews become the only people allowed to lend money? Because I think that furthered hatred through the centuries of Jewish people beyond, whoever we think deciding that they crucified Jesus.
There were rules in certain countries in the Middle Ages that stated that the Jews could not own land.
Oh, okay.
And so they had to then develop other forms of making a living. So there were different trades that they developed, different crafts, but also some of them, in some places, went into financial services and banking. And so that's where that developed. So it was a response to the prohibition of owning land. This was true in Italy and in France, and perhaps some other places I'm not completely familiar, but in what is now Italy and France, I should say, because those were very different places in the Middle Ages. I'm talking.
I would like to ask something, if I may.
Yeah, sorry.
So I'm thinking about the parallels and what we need to learn from history to function in the world today. And the details of what happened is very interesting, but I'm thinking about like how I'm feeling right now and the oppression that I feel and fear. And fear is going to be bigger if we're not able to stop this. And I know that I've been thinking a lot about the crucifixion of Jesus and how courageous he was, and what many of us are asking ourselves to do to stand up for ourselves and to try and protect our democracy. And this strong arming that's happening in our country, and each of us individually needing to be really brave who are wanting to stand up. And I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of, like, I am really turning to my relationship with my higher power right now and really trying to be trying to clear myself out so I can ask what God wants of me in this moment. And I'm not exactly sure that I know how to hear that. And I don't actually know how brave I am. And I just think about the people that have been so brave over the course of history and have been willing to, I mean, even recent history, like Alexei Navalny. I'm just wondering if you could connect the crucifixion and what Jesus, how he was, and how we translate that into how we walk forward in this time.
That may be too big for me. I'm almost wanting to say that's a very big one.
Yeah.
But let me say, I mean, Angela, I almost want to invite you at this point, because Angela was part of a conversation yesterday, and I'll tell you why I'm inviting her to this, with Black church leaders who are organizing, who are coming together, who is talking to each other frequently about all the questions that you raise. And the important thing, I think, is not to dwell too much on the individual question of how brave am I, but focus more on the question, who is doing the work that needs to happen and who can I follow? Where can I join? What can I be part of?
Yes.
Because none of us are brave enough in and of ourselves. Jesus was, very clearly. He had his moment of weakness in the garden. We call it the moment of weakness. I call it purely human.
Yeah.
And Jesus then said, not my will be done, but your will be done.
I think about that often.
Yes. And so Jesus had a clarity about God's will that was unmatched, unrivaled. I don't think we're asked to have that same level of clarity about the will of God as Jesus had. But also then, therefore, in the times that we live in right now, it is more important to wonder who else is in this.
Yes.
Who is already operating, because being alone is probably the most dangerous thing
That's right.
right now. And there's a reason why we think about Black churches. Many of the things that we now experience as new are not that new for them.
Nope.
Yeah.
So they've developed resilience in ways that we are now going to have to do in response to what is happening. And
They have
that
a
is,
long, I understand that their view is long.
there's a long view. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Angela, do you want to say a few things?
Yeah, I think you mainly said what I would say, except I do want to go back in time and say that when we isolate Jesus and see Jesus as a single individual, we miss that Jesus was an event that was building through generations and had a swelling. So even Jesus was not just a standalone person being brave. Jesus came out of a family line. Jesus was cultivated. Jesus was fostered in a worshiping family and community, and he was building a network of relationships. So even Jesus, who is the Son of God and has gone ahead of all of us, even Jesus was not acting as a standalone individual. And it's through the lens of our white Western bias that we read scripture and see Jesus as the lone hero, like a cowboy. And he really wasn't. It was a collective movement, and Jesus was the face of it, the peak of it, the culmination of it. But even he was not an isolated figure. And so I think there are times in history when an individual is called upon to speak truth to power and be the face of resistance in a way that may even cost them their life. Martin Luther King Jr. comes to mind immediately. But he did not just get out of bed one day and go, I'm going to speak truth to power and step in front of a bus. There was a long building in that was in a context, a historical context, a family context, a church context, and he was cultivated over time. And I think it's really important that we understand these moments of activism in their collective contexts. And that's why my interest in this time has been to deepen my connections. If there's a group called Black Church Political Action Council, which is one of the leaders is one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. His name is Michael McBride. He's also a pastor here in Berkeley. And
Is that your friend who's sick?
What's that?
Is that your friend who has been ill?
No, it's a different Pastor Mike, but they are best friends. And they went to seminary together. But McBride works nationally. He has a local church, but he's also a national figure. And he does a lot of church organizing. And both Reverend Smith and Reverend McBride have really made a point that the Black church has been the institution of greatest organizing power in the Black liberation movement, and has even fostered other institutions like Black credit unions and the historically Black universities. So any power base of the Black community has come out of the Black church. And so for me, when we are in times of extreme duress, like we are now in, those are the voices I tune back into, and want to pull up my chair and listen. And what I can say is that they are making their guidance available through the Black Church PAC, Political Action Council. And here in Berkeley, we are organizing congregations, a multicultural coalition of congregations to be following the lead of the Black Church PAC. And we're going to invite McBride to come and talk to us about specifically what we should be doing even locally in Berkeley and across the East Bay, in light of what they're discovering, or what their think tank is seeing at the national level. So I am happy to include Hillcrest, include others in that. Some of what we're doing is Berkeley specific, but it's all relevant across the East Bay. And some of it is California. They're developing a social justice roundtable at the state level, Black church leaders, to kind of organize around key areas where we need to be active resistors at the state level. And they're really hoping, they're building a broad coalition of Black church organizations. And my feeling is if we can get white congregations or historically white congregations to also follow their lead and add more power to their movement, for me, it feels like I'm not gonna, when I hear them speak, I know I cannot assimilate the complex information of these times in the way that they can. They have been about this. They've been cultivated to play this role. They are in relationship with one another. They're thinking about it in very complex ways. And I deeply trust their judgment. And so I don't feel pressure to have to understand everything myself. Now, as I do this work, will there be a moment when I have to stand up and say something that might put me at risk? That could happen, but it won't be a surprise and it won't be out of the blue. And I will be well cultivated for it and well supported and backed for that moment. I won't be a standalone voice. And it's unlikely that it would have to be me, but I feel willing, but it won't be just me as a lone hero trying to do something.
And reinventing the wheel, right?
And reinventing the wheel, right.
I've been
Thank
thinking
you.
about this
Thank you,
for
Angela. Thank
I've been
you.
thinking about this for the last few years and watching Stacey Abrams and just realizing, she's not cowed down by whatever election results has been, nor her community. I just came to see that they have such a gift to give us because they have resilience over tremendous sorrow and suffering and frightening times. And they're thinking kind of like they talk about the Chinese. This is my sense that you could tell me that they're thinking generationally about where they're heading rather than you and I are just trying to get through the next 5 minutes, or me trying to get through the next year or something. I'm not, I don't have that wisdom. I think that's very valuable. I would love us to do something. I'm sure you and Niels have talked about this. You probably have thoughts about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do, and it's still coming together here, but as soon as I have any clarity, I will invite Hillcrest. It looks like probably our next step will have a training on the history of faith-based organizing in Berkeley. And then we'll have a training where McBride is going to come in and talk about the political action agenda of the Black Church PAC and what he thinks that priority areas should be for Berkeley and the East Bay. So when I know those training dates, you will definitely be invited. And anything else that we do beyond this, especially the broader East Bay stuff, but really anything we do, even Berkeley based, it's really rich learning to get to be among them. So I'll be sure to extend the invitation. And we'd love to have you with us.
Well, I'm sure we need to be coming with deep humility.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll be there as learners and followers.
Right.
Yeah.
Which feels more comfortable to me because I feel they need to do something, but I don't know what I'm doing. I'm
Yeah,
just trying to show up where I can.
yeah,
Mhm.
that's great.
That's great. When it comes, one of the things that I keep in mind when I think about the incredible resilience that many people have built, many women like Stacey Abrams and Mike McBride and Mike Smith, these pastors, you know, sometimes you have to say to yourself, all you have to know is that it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that alone gives me some hope. Like people have done it.
Yeah, that's right.
It's possible. So we can do it too.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
And there are people among us who know
Yeah.
a lot about how this is done.
That's right.
Yeah, where to put our energies, because we can get so scattered with every day there's something more devastating that's happening. And
Yeah.
and one thing I've been thinking about for myself too, I have to tell you, is that my blood pressure has been up. And I'm working on that. And I'm recognizing the importance for me to stay healthy so that I can be there for my family and for this movement. And I just want to be really aware of that.
So good.
Yeah. Yeah. Maintaining our health is going to be an important thing, I'm
Yes.
sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for letting me ask this question.
Mhm.
No, of course. Any question? Yeah.
Mm.
And so, Carolyn just left, but I really heard her when she said there are some, and you too, Chiki, there's so many pressing things. So why do I harp back to the kind of the older debates on anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and I think one of the reasons is that without some of that understanding, we're going to be poor allies with people who we need.
I had no idea really what it meant, to be honest with you. I thought it all meant against Jewish faith or something. I didn't know that they were pigeonholing the way that you described it.
Yeah.
I'm naive.
Well, it's so sleep. So it's so become part of the culture that I think a lot of it is done out of unawareness.
Yes.
Like the notion that the Jews killed Jesus. It's just people are just not aware. And if you read the Bible quickly, you would see it right there. And so it's understandable.
But the
I
history
was
is so helpful to understand the background, what was happening. That's what I love
Yeah.
about you. Skip was like that too. He would tell us what the background was.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and I think it's really easy for us to get in a place to say, but I'm not like that,
that's right.
right? And a lot of the times it is
Yeah.
from there are those what do they call it? Intrinsic biases, right? Where my thought processes, they're there before I hear them, before it's articulated. Racist thoughts, and I'm sure I hadn't thought about it, but anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. They're there, and until I hear it and acknowledge it and say, "Ooh, look at that,"
Yeah.
it's impossible for me to make any sort of a change.
Yes,
One-on-one, not so much, but just that collective thinking,
that's right.
being a part of that
Sue
collective
Lapet
thinking.
has her hand up, and then Jim.
This is kind of not totally related, but why is there the, I guess, pushback against the Holocaust or denial of the Holocaust, that people were killed? I mean, is that just a whole denial of Judaism or the suffering that people have gone through?
I mean, there is a whole story that you can't talk about Jews because the Holocaust. And so what you do if you want to be ultimately anti-Semitic, you deny the Holocaust. So there is then no longer a defense, and you always, it becomes another setup in the lies that anti-Semitism spreads. Now, if you think back to the definition I gave, that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, right? What is the biggest conspiracy that some people can come up with is the invention of the Holocaust. So they will spend oodles of time and energy trying to prove that there was no such thing as a Holocaust, so that they can prove once again that this was all a conspiracy theory. And that is what anti-Semitism is. And why do we have that conspiracy that, you know, of the Holocaust? So that Jews can kind of walk around the world scot-free, not ever be criticized. And in the meantime, amass tremendous amount of wealth and power behind the scenes where nobody can tell. But they, you know, run the banks in Hollywood and everything else in the world.
Well, ever since the
And that's so, but it's the ultimate conspiracy theory, of course, right? If you can construct something like the Holocaust, then you can do anything.
ever since Trump made that comment in his other term about, you know, good people on both sides.
That's
That, I mean, the Jewish people I know have been very concerned, you know, since then. Terrified, really, because so many have, you know, relatives, of course, that were affected by the Holocaust.
yeah.
His own daughters become Jewish and her husband, so it's kind of bizarre to me that he doesn't care, I guess. It's
He does
all
not care.
politics to him.
And trust me, his son-in-law is not a good person.
No,
I mean, this whole idea of developing Gaza right now, and
right?
that's his son-in-law who's behind that a lot.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it's terrifying.
Uh-huh.
You have to laugh.
Yeah. We have a dictator now in charge. I just wonder, I tried to look in the Bible and find how people dealt with some of the dictators in the Bible, if there were any instructions or ways that we could cope with them or defeat them. I always thought the Bible was a book of liberation, liberation of spirit and mind, and it culminated in Jesus coming into this world. It was a plan, a cosmic plan from God, and to come down to our little neighborhood here on earth. But yes, I'm all these things that they thumb their nose at, the court, the Congress, the due process, the law, they are becoming for people that are in churches someday.
Yeah.
So I'm outspoken, I suppose, and they'll come for me, but I'm old, I can take it.
What I say, thank God we're
I
old.
mean,
Well, we're going to watch a movie together in May. I'm doing a grown-ups movie night. So we have the family movie nights on the last Friday of the month now, but we're going to do occasional grown-up movie nights on a Wednesday evening. 15th, I forget exactly what the
I
time.
thought it was the 20th or something, because
20th.
I think so.
I'll be sure to remind everybody. It's
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm gone and I'm disappointed I'm gonna miss that.
Oh yeah, we're going to watch God and Country, which is a movie about Christian nationalism.
Ugh.
oh, wow.
And yeah, it's going to be frightening to see how very different movements come out of the same Jesus event, as Angela called it. I
Yeah.
mean, it's absolutely stupefying to watch, and but we have to be aware. It's, you know, if we consider ourselves Christians and members of the church, we have to be aware how other people express and experience this faith and what they are doing with it,
Yeah,
and come
I
up
was
with answers.
had the experience of going to a Southern Baptist church in my teen years, and they believed that the Jews killed. And I said, no, I said the Romans were, in back of all the all of this. And I said that was their practice, you know, to always crucify people that, you know, opposed, that was a threat. Oh, no, no. And then they had they lapsed into what the Bible said was true, you know, let's read it. No, and so many things I was opposed to what they said, but that was part of my you know, bringing. I
Right.
learned better that I
Yeah.
had some of my insights were correct, and I was able to express them later in life. And so when I got to college, I had professors that kind of developed my insights and stuff and challenged me, of course.
Yeah.
So,
All right, you guys, I'm going to sign off.
Okay,
Okay.
well, very
Bye-bye.
interesting. Lots more we could talk about, but.
Lots more we'll talk about. We sure will.
I
Yeah.
love having these discussions. It's